What happens when genius meets abandonment? When a mind capable of reshaping reality discovers it was never truly wanted. Today, we dive into the twisted psyche of Loki Laufeyson, the god of lies. Behind his charming smile lies a psychological maze that has captivated millions. But what really drives the Prince of Asgard to chaos? The answer might disturb you more than you think. Our story begins in the frozen wasteland of Jotunheim, where an abandoned infant cries into the void of an endless winter. This child, a frost giant by birth, would become one of the most complex psychological studies in modern mythology. But Loki's true tragedy doesn't start with his abandonment. It begins with his rescue. When Odin discovered the infant Loki among the ruins of battle, he made a decision that would echo through the cosmos. He took this child not out of love, but as a political tool, a bridge between worlds that could one day serve Asgard's interests. From his earliest moments, Loki existed as an instrument rather than a son. Growing up in Asgard's golden halls, young Loki displayed remarkable intelligence and magical aptitude. While his adopted brother Thor mastered the hammer, Loki mastered illusion, shape-shifting, and the subtle arts of persuasion. But beneath this prodigious talent lay a growing awareness that something was fundamentally different about him. Psychologically, this creates what experts call imposter syndrome, but amplified to cosmic proportions. Loki wasn't just feeling out of place. He literally was out of place. Every achievement, every moment of praise, carried the unconscious weight of his otherness. His mind began developing sophisticated defense mechanisms. Charm, wit, and manipulation became his armor against a reality that felt perpetually unstable. The royal court of Asgard, with its rigid hierarchies and warrior culture, provided fertile ground for Loki's psychological development. He learned that direct confrontation led to defeat, but cleverness could level any playing field. This early conditioning would shape his entire worldview. If you can't win through strength, you win through cunning. But there was something that nobody saw coming. The moment that shattered Loki's world came not through battle or conquest, but through a simple touch. When his skin turned blue upon contact with the casket of ancient winters, everything he believed about himself crumbled in an instant. The carefully constructed identity of Loki of Asgard revealed itself as nothing more than an elaborate lie. This revelation triggered what psychologists term an identity crisis of unprecedented magnitude. Imagine discovering that your entire existence has been a deception, not just who you are, but what you are. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. Every memory, every relationship, every achievement suddenly felt tainted by falsehood. Odin's confession that followed was perhaps even more devastating than the initial discovery. Learning that he was the son of Laufey, the enemy of Asgard, and that his adoption had been motivated by political strategy rather than paternal love, created a psychological wound that would never fully heal. The man he had called father for over 1,000 years admitted to viewing him as a tool, a bridge between worlds. From a psychological perspective, this represents a catastrophic attachment trauma. Attachment theory, developed by John Bowlby, explains how early relationships with caregivers shape our fundamental sense of self and our ability to trust others. When that foundation is revealed to be built on deception, the psychological damage can be irreversible. Loki's response was textbook: rage, denial, and a desperate attempt to prove his worth through increasingly extreme actions. His attempt to eliminate Jotunheim wasn't just genocide. It was psychological self-annihilation. By destroying his birth race, he was trying to erase the part of himself that made him other, the part that had been used to justify his lifelong sense of displacement. The banishment from Asgard that followed his failed coup represented the final severing of his connection to any stable identity. Cast into the void between worlds, Loki's mind began its transformation into something far more dangerous than a simple villain. And it was there that everything began to fall apart. In the cosmic void between realms, Loki encountered something that would complete his psychological transformation: Thanos and the Mind Stone. But this was a corruption of an innocent mind. It was the weaponization of a psyche already primed for destruction. The Loki who emerged from this encounter had undergone what psychologists call malignant transformation. His intelligence, charm, and magical abilities remained intact, but they were now directed by a worldview that had been fundamentally rewritten. If love was conditional, if family was transactional, if identity was fabricated, then perhaps the only honest emotion was hatred. His invasion of Earth revealed the full sophistication of his psychological evolution. This wasn't random destruction. It was calculated psychological warfare. Loki understood that the most effective way to break people wasn't through brute force, but by exploiting their deepest fears and insecurities. He turned the Avengers against each other not through magic, but through manipulation of their psychological vulnerabilities. Consider his confrontation with Black Widow. Can you wipe out that much red? This wasn't just taunting. It was precise psychological surgery, targeting her specific trauma and guilt. Loki had become a master of what psychologists call emotional intelligence, but twisted toward malevolent ends. His speech in Stuttgart revealed the core of his new philosophy: you are made to be ruled. This wasn't megalomania. It was his genuine belief, born from his own experience of being controlled and manipulated. From his perspective, he was simply making explicit what was already true: that power structures exist to benefit those clever enough to exploit them. The theatrical nature of his villainy, the dramatic speeches, the elaborate schemes, the need for an audience, revealed another psychological truth. Loki wasn't just seeking conquest. He was seeking recognition. Every grand gesture was an attempt to force the universe to acknowledge his significance, to prove that the abandoned child of Jotunheim mattered. But the true monster was still sleeping. The moment Loki crossed the threshold from anti-hero to true villain came with a single devastating choice: the elimination of Phil Coulson. This wasn't a strategic necessity or a moment of rage. It was a calculated demonstration of his complete rejection of human moral frameworks. From Loki's perspective, this act represented perfect logical consistency. If sentiment and loyalty were weaknesses that had been used to manipulate him, then eliminating them entirely was a form of psychological self-defense. By proving he could harm someone who posed no threat to him, he was declaring his independence from the moral constraints that had once defined him. This psychological evolution reflects what researchers call moral disengagement, the process by which individuals convince themselves that ethical standards don't apply to their actions. Loki had constructed an elaborate justification system. Humans were inferior, Asgardians were hypocrites, and he was simply accepting the brutal honesty of a universe that operated on power rather than love. But here's where Loki's psychology becomes truly fascinating. His moral disengagement was incomplete. Even at his most villainous, he retained certain boundaries. His schemes, while destructive, often contained elements of mercy or hesitation that revealed the presence of a conscience he claimed to have discarded. This internal contradiction created a psychological tension that made him uniquely compelling. Unlike pure psychopaths who feel no emotional conflict about their actions, Loki was constantly fighting against his own capacity for connection and empathy. Every villainous act was simultaneously a rejection of his past self and a plea for understanding. The question that emerges from this analysis is deeply disturbing. If circumstances had been different, if his adoption had been motivated by genuine love rather than political calculation, would Loki have become a hero instead of a villain? And if so, what does that tell us about the nature of good and evil? Are we all just one betrayal away from becoming monsters? To understand Loki's psychological profile, we must examine the scientific principles that govern his behavior. His actions, while destructive, follow clear patterns that align with established psychological theories about trauma, attachment, and identity formation. Research in developmental psychology shows that children who experience early abandonment often develop what is called disorganized attachment, a chaotic pattern of relating to others that combines intense need for connection with profound fear of abandonment. Loki's relationships perfectly exemplify this pattern. His desperate attempts to gain approval from Odin, coupled with his simultaneous efforts to destroy the very thing he sought approval from. His mastery of manipulation can be understood through the lens of emotional intelligence theory. While most people develop emotional intelligence to build better relationships, trauma survivors sometimes weaponize these skills as survival mechanisms. Loki's ability to read people's psychological vulnerabilities and exploit them represents this adaptive skill turned destructive. The phenomenon of narcissistic injury provides another framework for understanding his behavior. When individuals with fragile self-esteem experience profound rejection or humiliation, they sometimes respond with what psychologists call narcissistic rage, a cold, calculating form of retaliation designed to restore their sense of superiority. Loki's elaborate schemes often serve this psychological function rather than practical goals. Studies of adopted children who discover their adoption late in life show patterns remarkably similar to Loki's psychological journey: identity confusion, feelings of betrayal, and sometimes a complete reconstruction of personality around the trauma of discovery. What makes Loki unique is the scale and supernatural context of his experience. Perhaps most importantly, research on post-traumatic growth suggests that individuals who experience severe trauma sometimes develop enhanced capabilities as coping mechanisms. Loki's magical abilities, strategic thinking, and charismatic manipulation might all represent forms of psychological adaptation to his traumatic circumstances. The truly chilling realization is this: Loki's behavior isn't madness. It's the logical response of a highly intelligent mind to a series of devastating psychological injuries. This wasn't insanity. It was cold calculation. What remains after the storms of Loki's rage have passed? His legacy isn't just one of destruction, but of psychological awakening. Through his actions, he forced everyone around him to confront uncomfortable truths about power, family, and the nature of identity itself. Loki's impact on the Marvel Universe extends far beyond his direct actions. He served as a catalyst for growth in other characters, forcing them to examine their own assumptions and moral boundaries. The Avengers became stronger, not just because they faced a powerful enemy, but because they faced an enemy who challenged them intellectually and emotionally. His relationship with Thor underwent a profound transformation through their conflicts. The simple dynamic of good brother versus evil brother evolved into something far more complex, a meditation on how different responses to trauma can shape destiny. Thor's journey toward wisdom was largely driven by his attempts to understand and ultimately save Loki. From a broader perspective, Loki represents something profound about the human condition: the possibility that our greatest weaknesses and our greatest strengths often spring from the same source. His intelligence, charisma, and magical abilities made him both a formidable villain and, eventually, a complicated hero. The very traits that enabled his destructive phase also enabled his eventual redemption. The psychological concept of post-traumatic growth suggests that individuals who successfully process severe trauma often emerge with enhanced empathy, wisdom, and strength. Loki's later evolution toward anti-hero and occasional ally represents this phenomenon on a cosmic scale. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of Loki's legacy is how it forces us to question our own moral certainties. If someone with his intelligence and capabilities could be driven to villainy by trauma and rejection, what does that say about our own potential for darkness? How many of our heroes are simply people who were loved well enough to avoid becoming villains? The God of Lies ultimately revealed the most uncomfortable truth of all, that the line between hero and villain isn't drawn by destiny, but by the quality of love and acceptance we receive when we're most vulnerable. But perhaps he wasn't the last to walk this path. In studying Loki, we discover that monsters aren't born. They're made through a series of choices, circumstances, and psychological wounds that transform brilliance into destruction. The God of Lies teaches us that behind every villain might be a broken child who was never taught that they were worthy of love. The most terrifying villains aren't those who embrace evil, but those who believe their darkness is justified. Sweet dreams.